My name's Franklin McKinney. I'm an attorney, typically practicing in Western North Carolina in a small town called Murphy. I spent a little time in the Air Force when I was younger and went back home to practice law afterward. I'll go ahead and get to why we're all here. I guess everybody's seen the news. Last night, the Supreme Court decided that they were not going to hear arguments in a case that it was my understanding that the Supreme Court had original jurisdiction over. Original jurisdiction is a little bit different than Supreme Court's typical role, whereas they'd actually be hearing, having a trial on the court. It's typically a court of review. Most of you probably know that. I believe there were about 22 states that signed on with Texas against Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia over what can only be described as obvious fraud on a massive scale. Supreme Court decided in a 7-2 decision, best I could tell, that Texas didn't have any standing to challenge elections that were carried out in other states. The crux of Texas' argument was that there were consent decrees entered into by secretaries of state and governors in the battleground states that we've all been following very closely that were, quite frankly, unconstitutional. State legislatures have sole authority over conducting elections and what technology is going to be used, the method that that's going to be used to carry it out. But the Supreme Court has decided that they didn't want to have a trial. They didn't want to make a decision about it. And what I think is important to understand is that there's other suits coming down the pipes. Lynn Wood, who we're actually here collecting some dollars for, has a suit filed on behalf of himself personally as a voter in Georgia against the Secretary of State down there. And I think the Supreme Court's going to have to make a decision very soon about whether or not he has standing as a voter. If they are to decide that a voter in one of these states doesn't have standing to bring an action, and I'm not really sure who does, and I think that's a blatant abdication of their responsibility. But Mr. Collins, if you want to pitch in on this a little bit.
You hit the nail on the head so far.
I want to open up for questions because I'm sure everybody's watching this happen and wondering how we got here and where we're going.
I have an issue with where in the Federal Register there is any definition for standing. I don't understand how it has become such a benchmark for litigants in any environment. You know, standing argues that a person must first be injured before a charge can be brought. The federal judge several weeks ago said you should have brought this suit earlier. Well, earlier nobody had been damaged, and then after it's too late.
I think you're referring to one of Sidney Powell's lawsuits.
Yeah.
And my understanding of the court's decision there was, and I think that was a federal court below the Supreme Court that made that decision, probably the 11th Circuit.
Yeah.
They essentially said, well, you didn't challenge this after the consent decree was entered, so now that they've used this consent decree to engage in massive fraud, it's too late. I don't know, as an attorney, if that had happened to me, I would be feeling like the court was telling me that I had to bring a case about something that hadn't happened yet. And it's backwards.
Well, the fact that the consent decree was kept secret
Sure.
should have been a problem there too.
And I think that was actually specifically alleged
Yes.
in Sidney Powell's complaint, was that this consent decree was entered into as a part of a separate lawsuit and wasn't publicized. I think there were numerous members of the state legislature that weren't even aware of it. And they're the folks that have the power to do something about it. So I'm with you as far as standing. But if what we're really talking about with the Texas case is the Supreme Court has decided that one state has no standing to challenge the election carried out in another state, even though it affects a national election. And most of us here are probably aware of President Trump's executive order from 2018 designating national elections, at least, as critical infrastructure. If the way I look at that is, if one voter is disenfranchised or injured in one place in a national election, then the same thing applies to everybody. If you cheat somewhere and it affects the result, then everybody's injured, whether you voted for the person who rightfully won or not. More questions on that? Sure.
So, fraud is a crime, correct?
Yes. It could also be a civil action.
So, also the violating state election laws is a crime, correct?
In the respective states, sure.
Yeah. So, so why are we bypassing the normal, to me anyway, the way I'm seeing it, and I haven't seen it or heard it, or so I'm wondering why. So if it's all a crime and all this kind of stuff, the normal procedure that I'm understanding is that when there's a crime, then you take it to the sheriff and then launch investigation, and then you find the guilty parties, and they've got videos of the actual parties. And generally when you go to there's a major crime mafia type thing or whatever, RICO or whatever, then you start where you can start, and then you start moving up the chain by getting them to flip or whatever. So why are we bypassing all that where it's the people's protection starting at the low level and then moving up the chain, instead of jumping to a judge who we have many radical left judges who just ignore things and then outrule the people as they have time and time again, going against the people's vote. So we know you're going into dangerous territory. So why is that being pursued in that direction?
Well, I think there's multiple tiers to that. Not only that question, but to try to answer it. Typically, voter fraud has to be prosecuted in the local jurisdiction where it happens. So if you don't have a district attorney or a sheriff's department or a police department in an area that's interested in enforcing those laws, they're not going to be enforced. And if those acts or crimes are carried out without the awareness of law enforcement, or at least the law enforcement that can do anything about it, then they're going to go undetected, and then we're all falling back on the FBI and the DOJ, and we know where that goes. What I think we're talking about here is not just a little bit of voter fraud. I think we're actually talking about cyber warfare. There's connections here to numerous foreign countries that have a vested interest in changing the outcome of this election. And to your point about it being a crime, I think that is probably the appropriate level of enforcement. I think it needs to happen at the national level. I think we're talking about cyber war from foreign actors.
Conducted by who?
Let me ask a follow-up for that. Let's assume that it was filed on a local level. Play out the time frame according to January 20th.
Well, that's another problem, and that's something that hit me immediately when you asked the question. We don't have time. Typically, if we're talking about the lowest level criminal behavior that's prosecuted in this country, it takes months. And we're staring down the barrel of a January 20th inauguration. There's simply no time to prosecute that. There's too many ways to hog tie that train, to keep that train from rolling down the tracks. And that's another part of the reason why we're here. We're up against the clock. And you had something.
I forgot what it was.
Well, I think about who was engaging in, which foreign actors were responsible for this. Well,
You got the CIA operating in Germany, and you have raids there picking up servers. Who's doing this?
who's performing the raids?
No, who's performing the treason.
Well, going back to Sidney Powell, something that really hit me in reading her first couple of larger lawsuits, there are allegations in there based on testimony from folks, military IT experts, intel folks from the 305th Military Intelligence Battalion, and they're laying the blame at the foot of Russia, China, and Iran. And we all know China's heavily influencing numerous political figures here. I think they're probably the primary driver, but I don't think they're the only one. Talking about the servers in Frankfurt that we've heard a lot about, that's to be believed, and I tend to. Our votes were being counted in Germany, sent to Barcelona for further scrubbing, and then sent back here. I think that when all this unravels, if it unravels, we're going to find that there's a host of countries that have a vested interest in what's happened. Anybody else? Sir?
Legally, what happens after, I mean, as far as in the courts? What's, I mean, we're out of time, like you said, so in the next 20 days, next 30 days or less, by a court system, what can happen? Anything?
Well, the Supreme Court's going to have to get up off the bench, pun intended. They're going to have to take up something. There's the only other solution to this comes from the executive or from Congress, and we don't expect any good things to come out of Congress. So I don't know the answer to that question, but there's certainly more cases coming down the pipe. Lynn Woods in Georgia being one of them. Sure.
Isn't there a historical precedent for not conceding the election? If Trump says, no, I refuse to concede, it goes to the Congress, and the Congress votes one vote per state. Is that not correct constitutionally? And I have a second question that may be getting ahead of you, is the invocation of the Insurrection Act too, as it's currently written, right?
Sure. I think, well, before I get to the Insurrection Act, I think the pretext for that is the executive order from 2018 on foreign election interference. And there's actually a report due on that from the Director of National Intelligence 45 days past November 3rd. We're coming up on that, I think, next Thursday or Friday. As far as the precedent for not conceding, of course, everybody remembers the 2000 election with Gore and Bush. And, we're coming up on the date when Al Gore finally conceded.
I was talking about year 1800 and 1824, I think it was in both those 2 years.
Well, this is not the first time there's been fraud, of course. I think we're a long way from precedent right now. And part of that's because of technology. Part of that is because of computers, if you will, and our votes being tallied digitally, which probably should never happen.
Under equal protection, doesn't the fraud in Pennsylvania, Georgia, all these other states harm every other voter in this country, whether you voted for Trump or Biden?
Well, I think there's an equal protection argument under the 14th or 5th Amendment, but I also don't think we even get there. I think it's on its face. Another state ought to have standing. It's a national election. Pennsylvania didn't just vote for the president of Pennsylvania. Obviously, that has an effect on who's going to be the president of Texas too, and that was the thrust of that case in my mind, and I think it's a bad joke that the court decided there was no standing. They're bending over backwards essentially not to do anything about it, and I think most of us probably have a suspicion as to why that is. Yep.
By saying that Texas and 20 other states have no standing, are they saying that basically the next president is not their president?
Well, that's the
That
logical.
doesn't affect them.
That's the logical travel of that
So
argument.
as of the Supreme Court just created secession, they have told these states, you don't have standing, the next president doesn't apply to you.
Certainly laid the foundation for it.
So haven't they already done it?
I think so.
And they're the Supreme Court, so they've done it.
It's a court of last review, right? And if they're not going to make a decision about it, they're leaving that in the hands of everyone else, and we're beyond the law. That's the way I see it.
Exactly.
Anybody?
Peter?
Trying to get your opinion.
Oh, so go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to go back to your question about local process and everything, and it's something that isn't just at the local level, but all the way up in the investigative prosecutorial chain. The concept of prosecutorial discretion goes from really stupid case, real case, back when I was doing something else. My boss prosecuted a poor guy for stealing a chicken leg in an affluent county in Long Island, and she was happy about that. She said that made her a tough lawyer. Okay, good luck with that. But that, she had the discretion as just a basic sworn-in assistant district attorney to prosecute that case or not prosecute that case. Now, extrapolate that all the way up to Bill Barr, who I understand got his beginnings with Daddy Bush and the CIA, and then there's his involvement, was it Waco or, yeah, it was Waco. Ruby Ridge, yeah. So understand, and the reason I'm bringing that point up is prosecutorial discretion is one of the most dangerous tools in government's hands. And Soros et al., Open Society Initiative, has been very strategically targeting high influence, high population places to make sure that any kind of prosecutorial discretion bends against the interest of the traditional Americans. Our organization today, and Franklin, thank you for that wonderful, condensation of a lot of detail. We have a special bulletin, a breaking news bulletin and briefing from Franklin. The rest of our day is going to be past. Our next speaker will be talking about the past and the significance of this area right here. There are others speaking about normal, present day times and the future. But keep that idea in mind as we go forward. And Franklin, call me out if I'm wrong on that, but prosecutorial discretion is an incredibly dangerous tool to be misused.
I want to piggyback on that a little bit. I think that's really important for everybody to understand. It's, a district attorney is probably the most powerful elected official in any jurisdiction, I would say, wouldn't you?
Agreed.
In what he's talking about with prosecutorial discretion, that's why Kyle Rittenhouse is in prison, or was until he was bonded out. That's why you see things like Antifa, BLM rioting and attacking people, and then the folks that defend themselves end up being charged when the aggressors don't. That's how important prosecutorial discretion is at the lowest level and the highest level. And remember that when you vote. Sure.
So, you want to outline the plan real quick for who's funding the election campaigns for DAs across the country?
Well, as Peter's mentioned, George Soros' Open Society Foundation has elected an awful lot of district attorneys in this country. And it ought to worry everyone. Kim Gardner, I think, just got pulled off the McCloskey case after fundraising on the back of that silly prosecution. But she's not the only one. There's plenty more, and there's probably a bunch that we're not aware of.